Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The issue we're analyzing today is the fact that Adolf Hitler was the most consequential person of the last 500 years. That just means that Hitler had the biggest impact on the world. Of course, he was the most horrible person during that time, and, in my vote, of all time. Some of you might be wondering, why do an episode about Hitler? We all know he was a bad guy and caused a lot of suffering. My answer is this. I think the world has forgotten just how bad Hitler was and how much death and destruction he brought into this world. And it's important to see how one person can alter the world to such a degree. The insane and evil policies of Adolf Hitler changed the world more than anybody since Christopher Columbus. And change simply means change, making things different. It doesn't mean good or bad. When we're talking about how much somebody changed the world, we're not talking about whether those changes were good or bad, or if the person was good or bad. Columbus is an easy example. He did not discover the New World. Of course, it was already here, and there were plenty of people already living here in the Western Hemisphere. But he did teach Europeans how to get to the Western Hemisphere. This changed the world in so many ways. This phenomenon is known as the Columbian Exchange. Just to name a few of the major consequences Columbus had on the world. Number one, European diseases killed approximately 90% of the Native Americans throughout the Western Hemisphere. Number two, the Spanish language and Catholicism both dominate approximately half of the Americas. Number three, Columbus's voyages started the colonization of the Western Hemisphere, and that eventually led to the resulting transatlantic slave trade, which resulted in millions of people sent to the Americas as human chattel. And number four, some of the food staples which were brought back to Europe, most notably potatoes and corn, resulted in a massive population growth in Europe. And this greater population could go on to other occupations besides farming, accelerating the shift from feudalism to capitalism. This was one of the reasons for the progress of European societies and why Europe eventually dominated the entire world from the 1500s until the end of World War II. Obviously, most of these results were terrible for the world, but they were huge changes. The actions of a person in power can cause drastic changes to the world, even if they are inadvertent. A lot of the changes that resulted from the explorations of Christopher Columbus were completely unintentional. Most of the changes that resulted from the despicable actions of Adolf Hitler were intended, but some of them were not. This does not mean that he is not to blame. Hitler embarked on an unhinged plan of conquest and murder, which caused so much damage and heartache throughout the world, and he is certainly responsible for the direct results of his actions. Now, before I go into the horrors that were a result of Adolf Hitler, some of you might be thinking that you have nominees who were contemporaries of Hitler that were just as bad, or arguably worse, and also caused great damage to the world. Certainly the person that gave Hitler the most competition for biggest scumbag of the 20th century was Joseph Stalin. In the 20th century, Stalin certainly altered the world more than anybody other than Hitler. And of course, all of those changes were bad. And if you tell me that you think Stalin is the worst person in the last 500 years, I could certainly respect your opinion. Unfortunately, there is no consensus for how many deaths are attributable to Joseph Stalin. Estimates range from 9 million to 20 million. Some argue that it's more than 20 million people. I know that 9 to 20 million is an incredibly broad range. But whatever is the actual total, it's a ridiculous amount. Probably the most infamous and most horrific of Stalin's crimes is the Holodomor. That is the term for the famine Stalin created in Ukraine in 1932 to 1933. At that time, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and the vast majority of Ukrainians were not happy about it. In a broader sense, the Holodomor covers more than just the famine of 1932 and 1933. It also covers the genocide of the Ukrainian people beginning in 1929 with the massive waves of deportations and executions of Ukrainians. In 1928, Stalin introduced a program of agricultural collectivization. Private farms, along with all equipment and livestock, were taken away from individuals and were now owned by the state. People were forced onto collective farms. Imagine being an individual farmer in Ukraine or even some other parts of the Soviet Union. You may not be living the greatest life, but you're reasonably content. One day, communist government officials come in and tell you that they're taking away your land, livestock, all of your farming equipment. And you and your family now have to move to whichever collective farm they are assigning you to. You have no choice in the matter. You are assigned particular work by whoever's in charge of that particular collective farm. You have no freedom of movement. You cannot just go someplace else. The Ukrainians tried to resist this collectivization policy. Stalin put down any resistance with armed troops. An estimated 500,000 people were deported from Ukraine to Siberia, where a large percentage of them died. Most Ukrainian farmers were forced onto the collective farms. The agricultural output of Ukraine plummeted. The smaller harvests were made worse because Stalin set two priorities above the local people. Number one, the crops were sent to the cities to feed factory workers. This was because Stalin was trying to industrialize the very backward Soviet Union, so he gave great preference to the factory workers. Number two, Stalin's government needed to purchase goods from foreign countries, and the only items he had to trade were farm commodities. The people who were actually producing the food were third in line. It soon became apparent that after the food was sent to the heavy industry workers and was sold to foreign countries, that there was not nearly enough to feed the agricultural communities. In case you're thinking that the farmers could just keep some of the food by hiding it, the Soviet government would not allow it. Armed guards searched the countryside for any hidden food and confiscated all they found and punished anybody who hid any agricultural products. As a result of this man-made famine caused by Stalin's policies, an estimated 4 million people died of starvation. Some estimate that the death toll was even higher. 4 million people dying of starvation would be horrendous under any circumstances. But in this case, it was worse because it was a man-made catastrophe. It's not like there was a drought like the Dust Bowl on the American plains in the 1930s. This was just a result of Stalin's policies. Another way that Stalin changed history was through his purges. Nobody loved a good purge more than Joe Stalin. And by purge, I mean removing people in an abrupt and violent manner. Stalin eliminated many people in several purges, but from 1936 to 1938, Stalin conducted what has become known as the Great Purge. Although he had been in control of the Communist Party and the Soviet state since the 1920s, by 1936, Stalin was worried that he might be losing power. So he had the NKVD, the secret police of the Soviet Union, start rounding up anybody that Stalin thought might possibly pose a threat to his authority. It started with the Communist Party members and government officials. Then Stalin expanded the Great Purge to the military. People just started disappearing in the middle of the night as they were picked up by the NKVD. We only have estimates for most of Stalin's crimes. I have seen estimates of between 2.5 million to 8 million people arrested during the Great Purge. Most were brutally tortured until they confessed to whatever purported crime was alleged by the secret police. Then the person was either sent to the Gulag or was executed. I've always thought that this was very bizarre. Why did they bother torturing people to make them confess? Really, when you think about it, what was the point? It's not like there were any courts that were going to review these cases. Stalin simply gave the NKVD lists of people to be rounded up and either murdered or imprisoned. So why did they need a confession? Nobody was ever going to see these confessions anyway. And if Stalin and his henchmen wanted to tell people that a particular person confessed, they could have just said so whether the victim had confessed or not. It seemed like an awful lot of time, effort, and most importantly, misery was spent torturing people to get a confession that was truly meaningless. If you have already determined that you are going to shoot a particular person in the back of the head, why do you need a confession? The best estimate I found is that approximately 1 million people were executed during the Great Purge, and the rest went off to the Gulag. What was the Gulag? That was the name of these labor camps throughout the Soviet Union. People were put to incredibly hard labor. A very large percentage died from the grueling work. The Gulag system was set up by Vladimir Lenin, but Stalin really expanded it. The figures I gave you a few moments ago were limited to the Great Purge, but throughout the Soviet regime, it is estimated that somewhere between 14 to 20 million people were sent to the Gulag camps, and that somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million people died in the gulags. As a reminder, we only have such broad estimates because the Soviet Union was a police state and we do not have accurate records. Most of those prisoners and most of those deaths that I just mentioned occurred during Stalin's dictatorial reign. Amazingly, there was another brutal tyrant in the 20th century, Mao Zedong, usually just referred to as Chairman Mao. After a long and brutal civil war, Chairman Mao claimed the formation of the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949 in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. I've always found it hilarious that a repressive, dictatorial regime like Mao's Communist China, where the people had no individual liberties or rights, referred to themselves as the People's Republic. During the brutal reign of Chairman Mao, an estimated 40 to 80 million Chinese citizens died as a result of man-made famine, disease, as well as torture and execution. These are just broad estimates because Mao's Chinese government was also a police state and historians cannot review any accurate records. One reason for the insanely high number of deaths from Chairman Mao is because he was ruling a country with a population of over 550 million people when he took over. So any of his policies in China affected so many people. I think it's important to remember dictatorial murderers like Stalin, Mao, and Hitler because it seems that the farther we get away from the mid-20th century, that people are forgetting how much pain, suffering, and devastation were brought on by these maniacs. It's important to remember so we can try to avoid other lunatics who, unfortunately for humanity, are charismatic and convince people to follow them. Of course, it's not just monsters like Hitler, Stalin, and Mao who affected great change in the world. There were good people, especially scientists, like Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, or Charles Darwin, or doctors like Jonas Salk, who developed the polio vaccine, or Edward Jenner, who developed the first smallpox vaccine. But since Christopher Columbus, nobody has changed the world as much as Adolf Hitler. I'll present my case regarding Hitler in a little bit, but first, here's a short biography of Adolf Hitler. On April 20, 1889, Hitler was born in the town of Braunau am Inn. At that time, Braunau am Inn was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I do not speak German, but it is my understanding that the name means the town of Braunau on the Inn River. That river formed part of the border between Germany and Austria-Hungary. Hitler's hometown was on the Austrian side of the river. The reason I bring this up is because Hitler was not a native of Germany. He was a native Austrian. There's an old joke that says that the greatest deception ever pulled by the Austrians is convincing the world that Beethoven was Austrian and Hitler was German when it was actually the other way around. Of course, the people of Austria then and now speak German, but the only time that Austria was part of the country of Germany was from March 1938 until the end of World War II. And that was only because Hitler, as the dictator of Germany, annexed Austria. So think about this. The most infamous person in German history wasn't really German. He was a foreigner who took over the country. Hitler moved to Germany in 1913, which was 1 year before World War I broke out. And even though he was not a German citizen, he fought in the German army in the Great War. After World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up into several smaller countries, one of which was Austria. Hitler renounced his Austrian citizenship in 1925, but he did not become a German citizen until February 25, 1932. Between 1925 and 1932, Hitler was technically stateless. He wasn't a citizen of any country. In early 1932, he had a fellow Nazi Party member appoint him to a low-level government job, which automatically made Hitler a German citizen. He did this so he could run for political office. Okay, enough about his citizenship. How did Hitler become the dictator of Germany? After World War I, Hitler lived in Munich, Germany. That is where he joined the German Workers' Party, which eventually became the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was a long name, especially in German, and they became known as the Nazis for short. Hitler quickly became the leader of the Nazi Party. Regrettably for the world, he was a very charismatic speaker. I do not say this with any admiration for this mass murderer, but unfortunately, it was true. Millions of people in Germany found him mesmerizing. He was able to whip up crowds into a frenzy, and people wanted to follow him. Besides being great at giving speeches, Hitler also knew how to brand. He did not invent the swastika, that was an ancient symbol, but Hitler realized that he and his party needed a simple emblem that would be easily identifiable. Hitler chose the swastika as the logo for the Nazi Party. He even chose the colors of the black swastika and a white circle on a red field for the Nazi flags and armbands. On the night of November 8 to 9, 1923, Hitler and the Nazis tried an armed takeover in Munich known as the Beer Hall Putsch. It was called that because it was launched from a beer hall. That attempted coup was forcefully put down by the police and some military units, and between 14 and 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested for treason. In April 1924, he was convicted and sentenced to only 5 years in prison. Throughout history, in most situations, when a person leads an armed rebellion and tries to overthrow the government by force, and that person fails, they were usually shot or hanged. And think about this, as I explained earlier, Hitler wasn't even a German citizen. In 1923 to 1924, he was still an Austrian citizen. This meant that a foreigner tried to overthrow the German government, and they still were very lenient with him. This shows the chaotic state of Germany after World War I and the fact that there were many people that were sympathetic to Hitler and the Nazis. Hitler didn't even serve the 5 years. He was released in December 1924 after serving only 9 months of his sentence. Since an armed insurrection did not seem that it would be feasible, Hitler decided to try to win control of the government through elections. Hitler's rise was not all due to his own skills. Regrettably for the human race, an evil genius named Joseph Goebbels became Hitler's propaganda minister. Goebbels was one of the first people to understand the power of mass media, which, at that time, consisted of newspapers and the fairly new media of radio and movies. And although he did not invent the idea, Goebbels might have perfected the technique of repeating a lie over and over and over until people believed it, no matter how ludicrous it was. Probably the best example would be the insane allegations against the Jews and their supposed conspiracies to destroy Germany. Joseph Goebbels understood that repeating the crazy conspiracies about the Jews over and over eventually led to more and more people believing these conspiracies, even though there was, of course, absolutely no proof or basis for them. The Nazis and Hitler probably would have remained on the lunatic fringe and a footnote to history if not for the Great Depression. After the Wall Street crash in October 1929, Germany suffered a worse economic collapse than the United States. In desperate times, people look to political leaders who claim to have all the answers. These demagogues don't have to explain any rational plan. They just claim that they are the only person who can fix all of your problems. Before Hitler became chancellor, the Nazis never got more than 37% of the vote in the Reichstag, the German parliament. But the Nazis were able to cause enough chaos in the Reichstag so that nothing could be done to govern the country. As a result, even though he really disliked Hitler, the 84-year-old president, Paul von Hindenburg, was convinced to appoint Hitler as chancellor on January 30, 1933. 1 month later, on February 27, 1933, somebody set fire to the Reichstag building. The Nazis blamed it on the communists. Although there is no definitive proof, a lot of historians believe it was the Nazis themselves that burned the building down. I am certainly in that camp. Using the Reichstag fire as an excuse, Hitler convinced President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, which essentially suspended all civil liberties and gave Hitler and his cronies fairly unlimited power to go after their enemies. On March 23, 1933, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act. This allowed Hitler to enact all laws without interference from the Reichstag or President Hindenburg. The law was passed with an overwhelming majority. It is believed that there was a lot of coercion and threats against the non-Nazi members of the Reichstag to get them to vote for this law. After this, Hitler was able to consolidate his power, and once President von Hindenburg died on August 2, 1934, there was nobody who could possibly challenge Hitler's authority, and he had absolute power as a dictator with the title of Führer, which means the leader. I want to throw in a few words about his personal life. Hitler did not get married until the day before he died. Throughout his time as the Führer, he had a girlfriend named Eva Braun. I use that term girlfriend because I'm not really sure what else to call her. He refused to marry her throughout his dictatorial reign, but she remained loyal to him and stayed with him in the bunker below Berlin when the Red Army of the Soviet Union was closing in. He married Eva Braun on April 29, 1945. She did this with the knowledge that she and her new husband would kill themselves the next day. They committed suicide together in the bunker on April 30, 1945. Now let's get to the reasons he is the most influential person of the last 500 years. The primary reason is that Adolf Hitler caused the worst cataclysm in the history of the earth, World War II. In this episode, I will cover the following topics on how Hitler changed the world more than anybody since Columbus. Number 1, I will outline the horrendous effects of World War II. Number 2, I will explain how Hitler caused World War II. Number 3, I will explain how he made World War II even worse than other wars. And number 4, I will explain the effects of World War II for the remainder of the 20th century and even to today. Topic number 1, the horrendous effects of World War II. I'm a baby boomer, and for me and most people of my generation around the globe, World War II still seems very real, even though we were born well after the war. Many of our fathers, including my own, fought in World War II. That gives us a tangible connection. There are not many veterans of World War II left, and there are not that many people alive who even remember the war. For most people throughout the planet, World War II is just something from the history books. It's not much different than the American Civil War or the Napoleonic Wars. My point is I think that people have lost touch with how dreadful World War II was. This was the greatest catastrophe to ever hit the earth. And that's not hyperbole. This was a disaster that affected not only people in the late 1930s and 1940s, but for decades after. Let's just start with the number of deaths. We don't have exact numbers, but the best estimate is that approximately 60 million people died during the war. Some estimates list the death toll well above 60 million. Think about that for a moment. Can you imagine a calamity of that scale happening today? 60 million people dying within approximately 8 years? To put that number into perspective, that would be like every single person in the following cities all dying. Los Angeles, where I live, London, Sydney, Cape Town, Rome, Berlin, Toronto, Paris, New York, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Prague, Dublin, Amsterdam, Montreal, Melbourne, Tel Aviv, Bratislava, Brussels, Chicago, and Auckland. And please note I was saying Auckland as in the largest city in New Zealand. Since I live in California, often if I mention that I've been to Auckland, people think I'm talking about Oakland, the city in Northern California. The point is if every single person in all of the cities I just named were dead, you would still not be even close to the number of deaths from World War II. And here's another way to put this incredible death toll into perspective. According to the National Institutes of Health, more than 3% of the world's population at that time died due to World War II. That is appalling. And as horrible as that total number is, you have to consider that of the estimated 60 million or more dead, approximately 3/4 of those deaths were civilians. And that's just the dead. The best estimate I could find for people wounded during battle was somewhere around 25 million. And that doesn't count the number of civilians who were injured or maimed as a result of the fighting. And even for those who physically made it through the war, how many were mentally scarred for life because of what they had seen and lived through? How many kids were made into orphans? We really don't know. One estimate I found was that there were approximately 15 million orphans just in Europe after World War II. I couldn't find an estimate for all of Asia, but I found one estimate for Japan of over 123,500 war orphans. The best estimate I could find for the number of Koreans who were orphaned because of World War II was approximately 100,000. I was unable to find any estimates for Chinese orphans, but it had to be an incredible figure because of the giant population of China and the devastation of the war from 1937 through 1945. And of course, there would be orphans in the Philippines and throughout other parts of Asia, the Pacific, Africa, and other areas of the world. All of these figures I just gave you are estimates. They all demonstrate what an incredible toll World War II caused on children from the 1930s and 1940s. How about the homeless? Millions of people were left homeless for a variety of reasons. For some, their homes no longer existed. They had been bombed or burned or otherwise destroyed. Most of the cities in Japan and Germany had been reduced to rubble by the Allied bombing campaigns throughout the war. And plenty of cities in Britain, China, Poland, and other Allied countries had been bombed by the Axis powers. And other cities in Europe, China, and other parts of Asia had simply been the scenes of massive battles. Some people were homeless for other reasons. Countless people had been expelled from their home countries and could no longer return. These people were known as displaced persons. These refugees fell into different categories. Many were European Jews who miraculously survived the Holocaust, but so many of these people had no home to return to. Some did not want to return to their home countries because of the way they had been persecuted. Another group of refugees were the people used as slave labor by the Nazis. Most of these people came from Eastern Europe. A lot of them did not want to return to Poland, Czechoslovakia, or the other Eastern European countries because those countries were now occupied by the Soviet Red Army with brutal communist regimes being established. I think you get the point that World War II was a true apocalypse in the worst man-made conditions that ever happened on the planet Earth. The reason I just listed all of those horrors is because Hitler was to blame. So now, on to topic number 2, how Hitler caused World War II. Without Adolf Hitler, World War II would not have occurred. Some people argue that World War II was inevitable. As I have said in other episodes, one of the things that makes history so interesting is that nothing is inevitable. There are sometimes factors that lead to certain events or conflicts being likely to occur, but nothing is inevitable. Obviously, Hitler tapped into the deep bitterness of the German people after losing World War I. But it's my opinion that war was unlikely without Adolf Hitler, and I'm going to outline why. If Hitler did not exist, we have no idea who would be ruling Germany in the 1930s. It's very doubtful the Nazis would have been successful without their charismatic leader. Even with Hitler, the most the Nazis ever got in an election for the Reichstag was 37% of the vote. It's hard to believe the Nazis could have done anywhere close to that without Hitler's magnetism. Without Hitler and the Nazis, Germany would have been governed in the 1930s by the people who believed in the Weimar Republic, or the monarchists, or the communists, or some other party. Whoever was in charge, we have no idea what their agendas would have been. But we do know what Hitler's plan was: another world war. Throughout the period of 1933, when Hitler came to power, until September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and started World War II, a majority of the German people supported the military buildup of the Nazis. They enjoyed the feelings of prestige from once again being a world power. But I think most historians agree that the majority of the German people were not in favor of another war. The average German did not look forward to another experience like World War I. You have to remember that this was approximately 20 years after World War I ended. Germany lost that war. Most adults had nightmares of the starvation and fuel shortages and, more importantly, the deaths of family and friends in the Great War. They also vividly remembered the chaos in Germany after World War I. They were not looking forward to repeating such a calamity. Since Nazi Germany was a police state, we don't have accurate opinion polls. However, there are objective indicators that the German people were not enthusiastic about another major war. There are at least 2 times when this was made clear. When Hitler would put on a military demonstration, the public would wildly cheer the German soldiers and the military hardware. These were signs of German strength. The German people no longer had to be ashamed of their defeat in the Great War. But this was not demonstrated in September 1938. At that time, Hitler was threatening to invade Czechoslovakia, and it looked like war was imminent with not only Czechoslovakia, but also the UK and France. As German soldiers were being marched towards the Czech border, there were no throngs of civilians cheering them on. The German populace was afraid and stayed home. The second time when the German civilians made it clear that they were not enthusiastic about another war occurred in August 1939. At that time, Hitler was threatening to invade Poland. When Hitler returned to Berlin from his vacation home in the Bavarian Alps, there were no crowds lining the streets to cheer him. Usually, tens of thousands of Hitler fanatics would come out just to get a glimpse of their hero. But not this time. They were afraid of the coming war. In addition to a lack of support from the civilian population, the military leaders were against a new general European war. The military leaders knew that Germany could not win a two-front war. That meant fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union and on the Western Front against the French and the British. Of course, the German military leaders were not enthusiastic about a single front war either. I know that today, especially in the United States, people like to make jokes about the French army. Yes, it's true that they were conquered very quickly by the Germans in May and June of 1940. But nobody foresaw that, not even the most optimistic German generals or even Hitler. France was a world power in the spring of 1940 with an awesome military that got defeated because the Germans used new and better strategy and tactics. Most of the German generals had fought in World War I. They remembered the horrors of the trench warfare and the general slaughter on the Western Front, which dragged on for 4 years. There are a lot of disputes as to the exact figures, but from what I've read, the death toll just on the Western Front of World War I was probably over 4 million. That includes both the Germans and the Western Allies. On all fronts of World War I, Germany lost approximately 2.5 million dead, counting both the military and civilians, and another over 4 million military wounded. This was approximately 3.8% of their population dead. Even without a war against the USSR, most German military leaders thought a war against Britain and France was a terrible idea. Some even voiced their opinions. More importantly, some of the top generals in the Wehrmacht, that's the German army, plotted different coups against Hitler because they thought a new world war, which Hitler was certainly planning, would be the destruction of Germany. Don't get me wrong, the German generals were not opposed to foreign conquest in principle. It's just that they were viewing the military situation at that time and did not believe that Germany could win. The opposition from the German generals was for practical reasons, not moral reasons. So you could see why the population and the military leaders in Germany were not overly anxious about another full-scale war in Europe. So earlier, when I was describing the other groups who might have been leading Germany in the 1930s if Hitler was not around, it is hard to see how such groups would want to start a second world war. But the German people and military followed Hitler with true devotion, and it was Hitler who ordered the invasion of Poland to proceed on September 1, 1939, which started World War II. And yes, Japan was at war with China starting in 1937, but it was the invasion of Poland that turned a localized war in Asia into a world war. Without Hitler, World War II does not begin in 1939. Not only did Hitler give the order to invade Poland, but he had a plan all along to conquer Lebensraum. That means living space in German. Hitler believed that the German people needed this Lebensraum in the East. Hitler had a long-standing plan to annex Austria and then conquer Czechoslovakia and then Poland, and eventually the Soviet Union. And it's hard to see how any other German leader would have taken those risks. In the fall of 1938, it looked like Germany would be going to war with Czechoslovakia, Britain, and France. Hitler would not back down and was willing to risk World War II if he did not get his way, so France and Britain gave in to his demands at the Munich Agreement. The point for today's episode is that Hitler was truly willing to risk Armageddon to get his way. How many dictators or any national leaders were or are willing to take such a risk? Joseph Stalin was as callous about human life as anybody in history. There is a quote that is attributed to him that says, "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic." That certainly sums up Stalin's mindset, but I've never been able to find any evidence that he actually said it. Even somebody as indifferent to human suffering as Joseph Stalin did not take the kind of risks that Hitler did. Stalin was willing to invade a very small country, at least by population, like Finland in 1939, because there was no risk of the Soviet Union being conquered. And in that so-called Winter War, the Red Army looked terrible. It took the USSR over 3 months of fighting to coerce Finland into signing a peace treaty, ceding some territory to the USSR, even though the Soviet Union had a population of over 170 million and Finland had less than 4 million people. And the Soviets had an overwhelming advantage in tanks, aircraft, and all military supplies. The point is, it is very difficult to see Stalin starting a fight against the Nazi war machine. And I know what some of you are thinking, that Stalin kept possession of all of Eastern Europe after World War II. But that was only because the Red Army was already occupying those countries. This was after Stalin had been forced into World War II after being attacked by the Nazis in Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941. If Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union, it is extremely unlikely that Stalin would ever have invaded Eastern Europe and risked an all-out war with the people of Eastern Europe, along with the Germans and possibly the British and the French. Until he died on March 5, 1953, Stalin never pushed the U.S. and its allies to the brink of a new world war like Hitler did in the fall of 1938 with the crisis over Czechoslovakia, and then in September 1939 with the invasion of Poland. This demonstrates that nobody other than Hitler would have started a new world war around that time. As I just outlined, Stalin would not have started such a war. Certainly, Britain and France would not have done so. They only reluctantly went to war against Germany when they became convinced that Hitler would not stop until he conquered all of Europe. Mussolini would not have started a major war in Europe. He only joined World War II after he was convinced that his buddy Hitler was going to win. So if none of the other countries would have started a new world war, and as I outlined earlier, it is very unlikely that another German leader would have plunged Europe into war, this leads to my conclusion that this 20th century apocalypse was caused by one man. Hitler's unique and insane world outlook is what caused World War II. Hitler's willingness to risk total annihilation was again demonstrated in August 1939. Hitler signed a treaty on August 23, 1939, with his arch-enemy Stalin, wherein they secretly agreed to divide up Poland and some other matters. He no longer had to worry about war with the Soviet Union. However, the British and French ambassadors emphatically told Hitler that if he invaded Poland, Britain and France would declare war on Germany. Hitler understood that an invasion of Poland meant a new world war. Even Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and the number 2 man in Nazi Germany, told Hitler in the days before the invasion of Poland that maybe they should reconsider their plans. Hitler gave the order to proceed with the invasion on September 1, 1939. On September 3, France and Britain both declared war on Nazi Germany. Here is Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announcing the war on the BBC.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
It is very difficult to believe that any other leader would have taken such a gamble. Hitler brought on a war against Britain and France, who, along with their allies, defeated Germany in World War I. And to make it even more dangerous was the military situation. German military leaders were extremely concerned that, as the bulk of the German army and air force was in Poland in September 1939, there would be very few troops to defend Germany's western border against the French and the British. The German defenses along their western borders were known as the West Wall in Germany, and for some reason in Britain, it was known as the Siegfried Line. This was not a very formidable defensive line, and the British and French probably could have conquered Germany if they had just invaded while the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe were all in Poland. But the Western Allies did not attack. Other than some fighting in Norway, they essentially did nothing on mainland Europe until the Germans invaded France and the Low Countries in May of 1940. Okay, Hitler's gamble paid off, but how many national leaders would have taken such a risk? I just outlined what a risky decision this was to start this war because I believe that any rational person was unlikely to take those steps to start this war. This goes to the whole premise of this episode. Historical facts show that Hitler was the one that started World War II. And as I just explained, it is highly doubtful that anybody other than Hitler would have plunged the world into this catastrophe. Okay, some of you are certainly thinking that even without Hitler, the war in Asia would have proceeded. That is true, but only to a point. It probably would not have been a world war. Japan had conquered the Chinese province of Manchuria in 1931 to 32. But the full-scale war of annihilation between Japan and China started in July of 1937. That is when Japan invaded the rest of China other than Manchuria. But if Adolf Hitler did not exist, would the Japanese still have acted that way? Nazi Germany posed a grave threat to the Soviet Union as well as the British and the French empires. All three of those world powers had a lot of influence in Asia. If not for the threat posed by Hitler against Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, would the Japanese have invaded China in July 1937? Or would they have been afraid that one or more of those three European powers would come to the aid of China? Obviously, we will never know. But even if the Japanese invaded China in 1937, would the Japanese have expanded the war against the British and French empires in Asia? And would they have brought the United States into World War II by bombing Pearl Harbor? Obviously, we cannot know for certain. But here's my argument as to why the Japanese would not have expanded their war beyond China. After invading China in 1937, the Japanese expanded their war against the European powers and the U.S. in 1940 and 1941. The Japanese only occupied French Indochina after the Nazis had already conquered France in 1940. That was the colonial name. French Indochina now consists of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The same holds true regarding the Dutch East Indies. That former colony is now the country of Indonesia. The Japanese occupied the Dutch East Indies after the Netherlands had been conquered by the Nazis. The Dutch were not a world power at that time and probably could not have done much against the Japanese. But would the Japanese have invaded the Dutch East Indies if they were worried that the British and/or the French might come to the rescue of the Dutch? We don't know. But I think it's fairly certain that the Japanese would have thought twice about occupying French Indochina if France was still at full strength and a world power like it was before the spring of 1940 when it was overrun by the Nazis. And although the British were never conquered by the Germans, in 1941 they were holding on by their fingernails. The Japanese did not have much to fear from the UK at that time. And yes, I am aware that the British fought the Japanese in World War II. I'm just pointing out that in the summer of 1941, the UK was barely holding on against Hitler and somewhat busy dealing with his inept ally Mussolini. British Commonwealth forces were stretched very thin in Europe, the North Atlantic, and Africa. But if the British were not in a war against the Nazis, the Japanese would have had to really worry about facing the full force of the British Empire, including the enormous Royal Navy. And would the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor? As history has shown, that was a terrible decision by the Japanese. Part of the calculations by the Japanese was that they were mostly going to be facing the United States alone. It's true that the UK had a lot of interest in Asia, particularly India and Burma, But with the dire situation that Winston Churchill and his government found themselves in 1941, the Japanese realized that the British could not commit many forces to fighting in Asia. So, would the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor if they thought that they might also be fighting the British and or the French? And here's an even better argument why the Japanese probably would not have bombed Pearl Harbor. The main reason the Japanese attacked the American naval base in Hawaii was because of U.S. actions. Although the U.S. had already been implementing economic sanctions against Japan, the full-scale embargo of oil to Japan occurred when Japan essentially fully occupied French Indochina. As I just explained, it is very doubtful that the Japanese would have invaded French Indochina if France had not already been conquered by the Nazis. If they did not occupy French Indochina, then America would not have enacted its oil embargo, and the Japanese would not have a reason to attack Pearl Harbor. In short, if there was no general war going on in Europe, would the Japanese have expanded their war beyond China? Probably not. Although we cannot answer these questions with complete confidence, we can say with reasonable certainty that, without Adolf Hitler, the war we know as World War II would probably have been localized in Asia and would not have been nearly as large and not caused the over 60 million deaths worldwide and all of the other horrors I outlined earlier. Now let's talk about topic number 3, how Hitler made World War II even worse, causing even more horrible change to the world. There are two main ways that Hitler made World War II even worse than any anticipated war in the middle of the 20th century in Europe. The first was his expansion of the war in 1941. It is very difficult to conceive of any leader of Germany involved in an all-out war with the British Empire deciding to invade the Soviet Union. Who else but Hitler would have done that? Germany was involved in a life and death struggle with the British, and while that was still going on, he ordered the invasion of the USSR in June 1941. And here's another crazy decision of his in 1941. This is always a fun trivia question. How many times did Hitler declare war upon a country without simply attacking them first or responding to a declaration of war from another country? The answer is only one, and it was the United States. The other times, he simply attacked the other countries without declaring war. It's true that after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. and Germany most likely would have gone to war against each other, but who knows when that would have occurred? A delay might have changed the outcome of the war. I just can't see any other world leader in Hitler's position in December 1941 declaring war against the U.S. when he did not have to. It was not required by any treaty with Japan. The other primary reason why World War II was so much worse than any anticipated war in the middle of the 20th century was because of the policies of Adolf Hitler. Let's start with the most obvious, the Holocaust, meaning the Nazi policy of committing genocide of all Jews within the physical control of German authorities. As most of you know, in the Holocaust, Hitler's Nazi regime murdered 6 million Jews. I find it so remarkable that one charismatic lunatic could convince a supposedly civilized country to engage in systematic murder on a scale never seen before or since. Obviously, there was a lot of anti-Semitism throughout Nazi Germany. And yes, I am aware that anti-Semitism was not limited to Nazi Germany. But without Adolf Hitler and his insane vision, there never would have been what can only be viewed as an industrial program of murder. Of course, some of you are thinking, what about the pogroms in Russia? Yes, those were horrendous. In a 4-year period from 1918 through 1921, more than 100,000 Jews were murdered in pogroms in Russia. Obviously, I am not diminishing such atrocities. But the Holocaust by Nazi Germany during World War II was on an entirely different level. This wasn't just destruction and killing on a haphazard basis. This was the most organized program of murder ever. People were rounded up and transported by trains to concentration camps to be systematically slaughtered on a modern business-like basis. It was done like the mass production of cars or other products. A lot of thought and engineering went into the most organized program of murder in history. When I was outlining the horrors of Joseph Stalin and Chairman Mao, I told you about all of the millions of people that they murdered. Obviously, intent did not matter to the victims who were killed by Stalin, Mao, or any repressive regime. But I think it does matter when we're talking about Hitler's personal influence on the world. Stalin and Mao killed tens of millions, but they had some horrible, twisted goals in mind. Essentially, those two tyrannical communist leaders were trying to modernize their countries, consolidate power, and eliminate their enemies. Don't get me wrong. Of course, I am not saying that their supposed sick goals somehow justified their utterly ruthless methods of genocide. I certainly rank Stalin and Mao as the second and third biggest monsters in the history of the world after Adolf Hitler. I'm just pointing out that there were some purported goals for all of their killing. In the case of Adolf Hitler in the Holocaust, it was simply killing for the sake of killing. There wasn't some objective that he was trying to achieve by murdering 6 million people. The actual annihilation of those 6 million was the goal. There was no objective other than murder. I think that is the biggest factor that separates Hitler from the other two monsters. The Holocaust was cruelty for the sake of cruelty. As I outlined previously, I do not believe that there would have been a World War II without Adolf Hitler. But if he did not exist, and there somehow was a major war in Europe in the middle of the 20th century, we would not have had the mass murder of the Holocaust. For Hitler, that was a prime objective. I think this was best illustrated during the last year of the war. Once the Americans, British, and Canadians invaded the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, it was clear to any rational person that Germany was going to lose the war. But Hitler and some of his fanatical subordinates still hoped that they could win due to wonder weapons like the V-2 rockets and jet aircraft. So, if you were in Hitler's position and you still thought that there was a chance you could win the war, you would try to do everything possible to give your country the best chance for victory, right? Well, yes, if your number one priority was to win the war or even to survive. But that wasn't the way Hitler ranked his goals. Hitler's number one priority was murdering the Jews. If Germany had to be destroyed to accomplish this genocide, then that was a price Hitler was willing to pay. This was demonstrated during the last year of the war by Hitler's resource allocations. As the Nazi war machine was being ground down, Hitler insisted on dedicating extremely precious and limited resources to the Holocaust. Foremost of these resources were the thousands of men who could be fighting the Allies, but instead were employed in the concentration camps and throughout occupied Europe, sending people to these death camps. In addition to the men, the Nazis wasted limited physical resources like trains, oil, steel, munitions, and other finite materials that the German military desperately needed. But instead of these valuable resources of men and material going to the military, they were being used to murder helpless civilians. Another policy of Hitler's that made World War II so much worse was his demand that Germany fight to the bitter end. In World War I, when it was clear they were going to lose, the Germans made peace with the Western Allies. This avoided the destruction of German cities, towns, industry, and farms. As I explained a few moments ago, after D-Day, it was clear that Germany was going to lose. They could have surrendered in the summer of 1944, but Hitler made them fight on to the very end. He did this because he was a megalomaniac and figured If he was going to die, he was taking down millions of people with him. But why did the German people go along with this? A lot of this had to do with Hitler's mystique and popularity. Somehow, the all-knowing and all-powerful Führer could still win the war with wonder weapons or some of his supposed genius. Hitler had that kind of a hold on the German people and the Nazi hierarchy. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. This resulted in the ouster and arrest of Benito Mussolini by people in Mussolini's own government. But this didn't happen to Hitler. And for those of you who are thinking, hey, what about the Valkyrie plot of July 20, 1944? Yes, it's true that German Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and his conspirators tried to blow up Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime. But that was a small group which did not have widespread support. This was evidenced when Hitler survived the explosion and the plot almost immediately collapsed. As a result, the German people followed Hitler to the bitter end and most of Germany was destroyed. And of course, Hitler's insistence that Germany fight to the end in May 1945 resulted in countless military deaths for the Allies and the Germans, as well as civilians throughout Europe that could have been avoided. And now for our fourth and final topic, the effects of World War II for the remainder of the 20th century and today. I believe that there are 6 main results that are attributable to World War II. Result number 1, the Cold War. When the war ended, the enormous Red Army of the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe. Despite all of his promises to the contrary, Joseph Stalin set up brutal communist regimes in Eastern Europe which would last for about 44 years. Germany itself was divided into 2 countries until 1990. After the war, there were now 2 superpowers who despised and mistrusted each other, and they had enough nuclear weapons to blow up the entire world. Until the fall of the USSR, the world lived in fear of World War III between the 2 superpowers. Result number 2, nuclear weapons. No country other than the United States even came close to developing an atomic bomb during World War II. This was because the U.S. was the only country which had the economic and strategic resources to invent nuclear weapons. But why did the U.S. make the Manhattan Project its top priority in World War II? It was the fear of Adolf Hitler. Anybody who understood that atomic weapons were possible lived in absolute dread of the idea of Nazi Germany developing the atomic bomb first. I don't think anybody doubts that Hitler would have used atomic weapons indiscriminately. And no, I'm not being a hypocritical American, since the United States is the only country to ever use atomic weapons in a war. I cannot go through all of the reasons in this episode, but I did do a 2-part episode entitled The Making and Utilization of the Atomic Bomb. Part 2 goes into the arguments in favor and against America's use of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even without the Manhattan Project, eventually somebody would have invented the atomic bomb. But when? Would it have been at a time when there was not as much animosity as there was between the US and the Soviet Union? We don't know the circumstances and atmosphere of the world that would have developed nuclear weapons without World War II occurring. But we do know what it was like throughout the Cold War when the threat of nuclear annihilation hung over the entire planet. And this was not just a theoretical discussion. In October 1962, there was a confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union called the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was the closest that humankind has ever come to destroying life on this planet. The point is that the existence of Adolf Hitler accelerated the development of nuclear weapons and introduced those weapons into the animosity of the Cold War. Result number 3, the end of European colonialism. Starting with the explorations of Christopher Columbus, Europe dominated the world. European domination ended after World War II. The end of the European colonial empires took decades, but this end was caused by World War II. The British, French, and Dutch empires were finished. France and the Netherlands had been conquered by the Nazis. And although the UK was never conquered and was on the winning side in World War II, it was essentially bankrupt and could no longer hold on to its vast empire. And although Portugal was neutral in World War II, the Portuguese lost their empire as European colonization around the world crumbled. Yeah, people forget that little Portugal controlled large areas of Africa until the 1970s. This collapse of European empires was actually one of the few good results of World War II. It meant independence for millions of people throughout Africa and Asia. Result number 4, American dominance. Before World War II, the U.S. was very isolationist. It had been that way throughout its history. The U.S. only changed because of the collapse of the European empires and the threat of the Soviet Union. Whether Americans wanted to or not, they were now taking a leading role throughout the world. I'm sure you have your own opinions as to whether or not this is a good thing. Certainly, the U.S. has committed plenty of bad policies and actions throughout the world since World War II. This was especially true when the CIA was involved. But overall, the U.S. has accomplished a lot more positive results than negative. Just to name a few, the Marshall Plan completely rebuilt all of Western Europe. The U.S. rebuilt South Korea and Japan. The United States, along with its allies, kept the Soviets and the Communists out of Western Europe, Greece, Turkey, South Korea, and Japan. Result number 5, space exploration. The Nazis led the way in rocketry. During the war, the brilliant German physicists developed the V2, which was an actual rocket. Fortunately, the V2s were deployed towards the end of the war, and although they caused death and damage in England, the destruction was kept to a minimum. After the war, the US and the Soviet Union snatched up as many German rocket scientists as they could. Wernher von Braun was the primary genius behind the V2 rockets. After the war, he became an American citizen and was one of the biggest reasons the US won the space race. An offshoot of the Cold War was the space race. The US and the Soviet Union were willing to spend insane amounts to beat the other to the moon. Would any human beings have gone to the moon if not for the Cold War? Maybe not. Once the U.S. won the space race and put 12 Americans over 6 Apollo missions on the surface of the moon, the world really lost interest. Nobody has walked on the moon since 1972. Now we do unmanned explorations to other planets and into deep space. Result number 6, the Korean War. Earlier I mentioned the fall of the European empires after World War II. Often overlooked was the end of Japanese colonies, particularly in Korea and parts of China. As an agreement toward the end of World War II, the Soviets occupied the northern half of Korea and the Americans occupied the southern half of the country. I don't have time to go into it here, but that led to a war from 1950 through 1953, which ended in a stalemate. Korea remains divided until this day. And if you're wondering about Vietnam, I could argue both ways. You could say it was not a direct result of World War II because it was not occupied by different sides of the Cold War immediately after World War II, like Korea was in 1945. After the war, the French tried to reestablish their colony of Indochina and were essentially there until 1954. That's when the country was split between a communist North and a democratic South. So you can argue this was not a direct consequence of World War II. Conversely, you can argue that it was a direct result of World War II because it was all part of the overall Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union never got into actual hot war fighting against each other. However, they did engage in these proxy wars around the world. Vietnam certainly fell into that category. All of these consequences that I just outlined were direct results of the insane and evil policies of Adolf Hitler. And that is why he is the most consequential person in history over the last 500 years. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Reviews really help. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to do. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, hopefully 5 stars, and then tap Write a Review. If you are listening on Spotify or any other podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for all of the history geeks out there. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.